This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Up Close is our new show on the Jewish Channel in which we take a deep dive into issues with interviews and small panels. In this first episode, we look at two major figures in history, Thomas Jefferson and King David. Examining King David, we have Yale University professor Joel Baden, who is the author of The Historical David, a new book in which he takes a look at the idea that David was a real person, but someone distant from that one described in the biblical narrative. But first, examining Thomas Jefferson is executive editor of Random House, John Meacham, with his new biography, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. With a book like this, you're exploring a very important figure in United States history, a revolutionary figure, but even more so, Thomas Jefferson remains perhaps the most controversial of the so-called founding fathers. And in particular of late, it seems that exactly what his biography was, exactly what went on in his life, remains an extremely controversial topic in terms of people disagreeing about what happened. Why do you think that's so?
Jefferson is, I think, the most vivid founder, and I think it's because no one articulated the promise of American life more brilliantly, and no one so overtly failed so badly to live up to those ideals in his private life. And I think when we're being honest with ourselves, we all know that we fall far short of the aspirational goals more often than we meet them.
You paint a picture of Jefferson living this life. It's a very privileged life, and it's very distant from a lot of the conflict that really characterized that early struggling.
Absolutely. He came from the very top of Virginia's slave-owning society. One of the most important things to recall is the revolutionary cause in Virginia was very much an elite phenomenon until a man whose name is totally lost to history, Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor, issued a declaration saying that any African American who fought for the British would receive their freedom. That instantly changed the dynamic and brought what we would now think of as the middle classes, the more working class people, into a frame of mind where the revolution had more resonance. So the story of the beginning of the country is not a unalloyed fairy tale by any means.
During that revolutionary period, I think there's only one time when you actually use the word patriot, and it's even in an oblique reference to him. It's not even a direct reference, and it made me wonder, do you even think of Jefferson as a patriot in those years?
Oh, I'd argue that he's a crucial architect of American nationalism, both in terms of its ideology with the authorship of the Declaration and a lot of other stuff. He wrote the some review of the rights of British America. Both inaugural addresses are hugely important in that. And as a practical politician, he doubled the size of the country without firing a shot. And while Jefferson is eminently quotable as a small government guy who was always for revolution every 20 minutes, he actually, if you look at what he did as opposed to what he said, he was a nationalist figure who built something that was worth protecting.
Right, and you actually emphasize the degree to which some of the statements that he made that continue to be taken out of context, and that the tree of liberty should be refreshed with the blood of tyrants, for example, not a reference to the British, but a reference to the continuing turmoil in politics here in the U.S.
Yeah. No president ever spoke in better needlepoint pillow terms than Jefferson. Yeah.
Comparing him to other presidents, one of the funny things that I quickly came to realize when reading this biography is no matter how far you turn back the clock, every president had daddy issues.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And it tends to be, to me it's really interesting. Presidents tend to come from either incredibly dominating patriarchs or have no father at all. There's almost nothing in between. If you're raising a normal child, they have no hope of being president. So with Jefferson, he died when he was 14, and he very much idealized that figure. An unusual number of American presidents have never known their father, or the name under which they became president was not their birth name. Gerald Ford, Bill Clinton, Andrew Jackson didn't know his father. Barack Obama met his father once. So it's a wonderful psychological study for a dissertation.
And now we have Yale University's Joel Baden discussing the historical David. One of the first premises of this book is that you believe King David, the legendary king of the Jewish people, actually existed.
Right, which in my world of academia is actually like more revolutionary than almost anything else that I would say in the book. We're missing all of the archaeological evidence for David existing, and any evidence of another country that would say mention David in writing. We've got that for later kings of Israel, but not for David. So we have this big gap. But that's pretty much an argument from silence, right? We don't have him, so he probably didn't exist. I think the way the Bible is written, the biblical story is written about David, it's almost impossible to imagine that he didn't exist. Maybe not in the giant legendary form that we usually associate with him, but existed.
That there was a guy.
There was a guy, and his name was probably David, and he was probably king. He was certainly king. And a lot of the things that tradition and the Bible ascribe to him as his great achievements, I think he actually did. I'm not sure he did them all for the right reasons, or for the reasons we'd like to think he did, or in the way that we'd like him to have done them. But I think he did them.
And you're saying that even from the very beginning, the stories that we have about David, that he was this harpist who entertained King Saul and sang ballads for King Saul, and then that he was also the giant slayer with Goliath. That both of these stories have some problems. They can't both be true.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about, as you said, right, this warrior poet image. Right, that is nothing other than the very first two stories about David in the Bible, right? The playing the lyre for Saul, and then Goliath. That's it. That's 1 Samuel 16 and 17, and those are the first two chapters about David, and that's where the entirety, I think, of the popular image comes from. I mean, almost the entirety. These two stories have this great weight, and neither one of them is true.
Because you find they're mutually exclusive.
They are mutually exclusive. I mean, if you try to read them in order, you have in the lyre playing story, right? Saul needs somebody to help him with his, sort of, night terrors, and so he has this boy David brought to him, and he sends a letter to David's father, says, I'm going to take him into my service, and I'm making my arms bearer, and he loves him. And then the very next chapter, David is suddenly no longer with Saul. He's got to come from home, and he comes to Saul and says, I'll fight and against Goliath. And Saul goes, who's this? Right? As if he's never heard of him, and then he sends a note to his father, right? It's like it's the same thing all over again, reintroduction of the character. It's two stories that introduce David to the reader, and they don't work together.
Within this larger scope of who he was exactly and what he was, you suggest that a great many of the other stories about him are approximating truth, that David and Bathsheba probably happened, that Jonathan and David to a degree happened. But you say that in general the Bible takes too charitable a view of these activities.
Right. The essential argument is what we have in the Bible is a pro-David version of events. There's not really anything surprising about that. I mean, David is the widely acknowledged hero of the Hebrew Bible. There's no one even close. Maybe Moses, but I'm going to still give it to David. David is the hero. And when you write stories about heroes, especially heroes who founded, the nation, the capital, the worship, you tend to want to portray them in a positive light. And so what I think we have here in the biblical account of David is really nothing more complicated than PR, right? The Bible is the PR guy for David, taking stories that happened and spinning them in a way that makes David come out as well as he possibly could given the circumstances.
Thank you for watching this abbreviated web version of Up Close. A reminder, you can watch the full version of Up Close on the Jewish Channel On Demand on cable. You can also listen to the full version of Up Close in an audio-only version available as a podcast on iTunes and elsewhere. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.